The operating room doors at Mount Sinai were just meters away. Isabella could smell the hospital disinfectant. She could feel the cold fluorescent lights on her skin. She could hear the sound of her own heart. Too fast, too loud, like it knew something her mind hadn't accepted yet. In less than 5 minutes she would walk through those doors. In less than 5 minutes they would put her to sleep. In less than 5 minutes surgeons would remove her uterus, her ovaries, her fallopian tubes. The only part of her that could have been a mother. Isabella was walking toward a biological death, and he was there. Antonino Rossi, the most dangerous capo in the city, the man with blood on his hands, the man who controlled entire cities. He was there, holding her hand like she was the most fragile thing in the world. "If I don't survive the operation," Isabella began to say. Her voice wasn't her own. It was the voice of someone saying goodbye. Antonino squeezed her hand tighter. "You are the only one," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an ordinary promise. It was an absolute declaration, a truth so brutal it sounded like a threat. "You are the only one who matters, the only one I will ever choose, the only one I have ever loved." His eyes, the eyes of a man who had killed dozens, were filled with tears. "So you will survive, because I can't live without you. And if you die, then I die too." Isabella looked at him, and in that moment in that sterile hospital, under those fluorescent lights, she believed she was the only one. She believed she was enough. She believed he would choose his love over everything. It was the last time she believed that. 2 weeks earlier, Isabella had been in the middle of her shift at Elmhurst Hospital when Dr. Marcus Chen found her in the break room. She was reviewing patient charts, a cold cup of coffee beside her, still wearing her white coat stained with the reality of a 12-hour day, treating patients who couldn't afford to be sick. Marcus closed the door behind him, and Isabella knew immediately that something was wrong. Doctors didn't close doors for good news. They didn't have that look in their eyes, the one she'd seen herself wear 100 times before delivering devastating diagnoses to families who couldn't afford to fall apart. "Isabella, we need to talk," Marcus said, sitting down across from her. His hands were folded on the table, professional and careful. She'd known Marcus for 6 years, worked alongside him through every kind of crisis Elmhurst could throw at them, and she'd never seen him look this uncomfortable. "Your biopsy results came back." She felt her stomach drop. The routine pelvic exam 3 weeks ago, the abnormal ultrasound, the biopsy she'd told herself was precautionary, the kind of thing she recommended to patients every day without thinking twice. Doctors were terrible patients because they convinced themselves they were invincible, that disease happened to other people, that their knowledge somehow protected them from their own mortality. "Ovarian cancer," Marcus said, and even though Isabella had already known, even though her medical training had prepared her for this exact conversation, hearing the words out loud made them real, in a way that terrified her. "Stage 3. It's aggressive, Isabella. We need to move fast." Isabella nodded slowly, her mind already racing through protocols and statistics and survival rates. Stage 3 meant it had spread beyond the ovaries. Stage 3 meant immediate intervention. Stage 3 meant her life as she knew it was about to end, one way or another. "Hysterectomy," she said. Not a question, but a statement. She knew the protocol better than anyone. She'd recommended the same procedure dozens of times to women sitting exactly where she sat now. "Complete," Marcus confirmed. "Uterus, ovaries, fallopian tubes. Dr. Reeves at Mount Sinai is the best oncological surgeon in the city. I already sent him your file. He can see you tomorrow." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next. "There's no way to preserve fertility, Isa. I'm sorry." There it was, the death sentence that had nothing to do with cancer survival rates. Isabella heard the words as if they were coming from underwater, distant and muffled. No way to preserve fertility, 0% chance of biological motherhood. The end of a future she hadn't even realized she'd been planning until this exact moment. "What are my odds?" she asked. Because that's what doctors did. They focused on numbers, on data, on things they could measure and control. 75 to 80% survival rate with immediate surgery and aggressive chemo, Marcus said. "You know the statistics as well as I do. But you have to move now. Every day we wait, the odds get worse." Isabella sat there in the break room of Elmhurst Hospital, surrounded by the institutional beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights, and felt something fundamental break inside her. She spent every day saving lives, stitching together broken bodies, fighting against impossible odds for patients who had nothing. She'd chosen this hospital, this life, because she believed medicine should serve those who needed it most, not those who could afford concierge care in marble lobbies. And now her own body had betrayed her, in the most devastating way possible. She thought about Antonino, about the fantasy they'd built together in whispered conversations in the darkness of his penthouse. Someday, he'd said months ago, his hand resting on her stomach with a tenderness that contradicted everything the world knew about him. When everything is different, when I can make you my wife properly, we'll have children, a whole family. Isabella had never asked him to specify when someday would come. She knew it was a fantasy, a beautiful lie they both needed to believe. Antonino Rossi, the most feared capo in New York, couldn't simply leave his wife and destroy a political alliance that held half the criminal infrastructure of the East Coast together. But the fantasy had been enough, the promise of a future where love mattered more than power, where she could be chosen over convenience. That fantasy had just died in a hospital break room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant. Marcus was still talking, something about scheduling and treatment protocols and support groups, but Isabella wasn't listening anymore. Her mind had already jumped ahead to the inevitable conclusion, the one her medical training couldn't protect her from. Without fertility, she couldn't give Antonino what his world demanded. Without heirs, she was useless to a dynasty that measured worth in bloodlines and legacy. She'd become a liability, a mistress who couldn't even fulfill the one biological function that might have justified her existence in his world. "Does anyone else know?" Isabella asked suddenly, interrupting whatever Marcus had been saying. "Just me and the lab tech," Marcus said. "Patient confidentiality, Isa. Nobody sees these results without your permission." But Isabella knew better. She knew how information moved in their world, how secrets had a price, how nothing stayed private when powerful people wanted to know. If Marcus knew, if the results existed in any database, then it was only a matter of time before someone found out. Before Juliana found out. Before Antonino's wife discovered that her husband's mistress had just lost the only weapon she might have used to threaten the perfect political marriage. Isabella stood up slowly, her white coat suddenly feeling like a costume, like she was playing a role she no longer understood. "Thank you, Marcus," she said quietly. "I'll call Dr. Reeves tomorrow." That night, she didn't call Antonino immediately. She sat in her small apartment in Queens, the one he'd offered to replace with a penthouse in Manhattan that she'd refused because she wasn't that woman. And she stared at her phone for 3 hours. Finally, at 11 p.m., she typed out a message. Simple, direct, the way she'd learned to communicate as a doctor. "I need to see you. Now, it's important." His response came 30 seconds later. "I'm in a meeting. Can it wait until tomorrow?" She stared at those words. Can it wait until tomorrow? As if cancer had office hours. As if her entire future wasn't collapsing in real time. "No," she typed back. "It can't wait." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Where are you?" "Home. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Isabella set down her phone and walked to the window, looking out at the Queen's skyline, at the city that never stopped moving, never stopped demanding, never stopped taking. In 20 minutes she would tell the man she loved that she was dying and infertile in the same conversation. In 20 minutes she would watch him process the information that she could never give him children, never continue his legacy, never be anything more than what she'd always been, a temporary comfort in a life built on permanence and power. In 20 minutes everything would change. She just didn't know yet how complete. Antonino arrived in 18 minutes, not 20. Isabella heard the SUVs pull up outside her building, the kind of convoy that made her neighbors nervous and reminded her exactly who she'd fallen in love with. She buzzed him up without a word, listening to his footsteps echo in the stairwell, because he never took the elevator, always the stairs, always ready for an ambush, even in a building full of working families in Queens. When she opened the door, he filled the doorway the way he always did. Antonino Rossi at 42 was a man who commanded space without trying. 6 feet of controlled violence wrapped in a $1,000 suit that looked completely out of place in her modest apartment. His dark eyes scanned her face immediately, reading her the way he read everyone, looking for threats and weaknesses and truths people tried to hide. "What happened?" he asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. No preamble, no gentle approach. That wasn't who he was. "You're scaring me, Isabella." She'd rehearsed this conversation 17 different ways in the 20 minutes waiting for him. She'd planned how to say it, what words to use, how to deliver devastating news the way she'd been trained to do as a doctor. But standing there in her small living room looking at the man whose world was built on control and power and legacy, all her careful planning evaporated. "I have cancer," she said simply. "Ovarian cancer. Stage 3. Antonino went completely still. It was the kind of stillness that preceded violence, the moment before he made decisions that ended lives and destroyed empires. Isabella had seen him angry before, had seen him cold and calculating, but she'd never seen him afraid until this exact moment. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. "What are they saying?" "It means I need surgery immediately," Isabella said, falling back on clinical language because it was easier than emotion. "Complete hysterectomy, removal of my uterus, ovaries, and fallopian tubes, followed by 12 weeks of aggressive chemotherapy. My survival rate is 75 to 80% if we move fast." She watched him process this information, saw his mind working through the implications the same way hers had. Antonino was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He understood exactly what complete hysterectomy meant, what it would cost her beyond just survival. "Who's the best surgeon?" he asked immediately, already pulling out his phone. "I don't care what it costs. I want the best oncologist in the country, in the world. We'll fly to Switzerland if we need to. Germany, wherever has the best—" "Antonino," Isabella interrupted gently. "It doesn't matter where we go, the outcome is the same." He stopped, phone in hand, and looked at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "What do you mean?" "The surgery will make me infertile," she said, and there it was, the truth that changed everything. Permanently. There's no way to preserve my fertility at stage 3. No eggs to freeze, no options to explore later. After the surgery, I'll never be able to have biological children. The silence that followed was absolute. Isabella could hear the traffic outside, the muffled sound of her neighbor's television through the thin walls, the distant wail of sirens that never really stopped in this city. But inside her apartment, Antonino Rossi stood frozen, and she could see the exact moment he understood what this meant for them. No children, no heirs, no future for a dynasty that measured worth in bloodlines. "We'll figure it out," he said finally, and she heard the desperation underneath the determination. "There are options, surrogates, adoption, ways to—" "Antonino," she said softly, "you know that's not how your world works." He crossed the room in 3 steps, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that bordered on painful. His heart was racing against her cheek, his breathing uneven in a way she'd never heard before. Antonino Rossi didn't panic, didn't lose control, didn't show vulnerability to anyone. But here, in her small apartment in Queens, he held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "I don't care about my world," he said into her hair. "I care about you. We'll leave. Tonight. Tomorrow. Whenever you want. I'll walk away from all of it. The family, the business, the entire empire. We'll go somewhere they can't find us. Italy. Argentina. Somewhere you can get treatment and we can start over." Isabella closed her eyes, letting herself believe it for just a moment, letting herself imagine a world where Antonino Rossi could simply walk away from generations of power and obligation, where love mattered more than legacy, where she was enough exactly as she was. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I do," he insisted, pulling back to look at her face. "Isabella, I swear to you, I would burn it all down for you. The Rossi empire, the alliances, everything. You are the only thing that matters to me." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so desperately it hurt. But she was a doctor, trained to see reality clearly, to understand prognoses even when they were devastating. And the prognosis for their relationship, for this beautiful, impossible love they'd built in the shadows, was terminal. "When is the surgery?" Antonino asked, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted every story ever told about him. 2 weeks, Isabella said. "They want to move fast. Every day we wait, the cancer spreads." "Then we have 2 weeks to plan," he said with sudden determination. "I'll arrange everything. The best surgical team at Mount Sinai, private recovery suite, round-the-clock nursing care, and after you've recovered, we'll go. We'll disappear. I'll marry you properly. Isabella, the way I should have done from the beginning." She looked up at him, at the man who ruled the criminal underworld of New York with an iron fist, who made grown men tremble with a single word, who had built an empire on fear and power and ruthless calculation. And in his eyes, she saw something she'd never seen before. Not just love. Desperation. The kind of desperation that came from losing control, from facing something money and violence couldn't fix. "Okay," she said softly, because in that moment she needed to believe it was possible. "Okay." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, and full of promises they both knew he might not be able to keep. And Isabella kissed him back, memorizing the taste of him, the feel of his hands in her hair, the way he held her like she was precious instead of disposable. She didn't know yet that across town, in a mansion in the Upper East Side, Giuliana Rossi was reading an email that would destroy everything. She didn't know that medical privacy meant nothing when you were the mistress of a mafia boss. She didn't know that the countdown had already started, not just to her surgery, but but to the moment when she would learn exactly how much she was worth in the cold mathematics of dynasty and power. For now, in her small apartment in Queens, she let herself believe in the fantasy one more time, that love could conquer obligation, that she could be chosen over convenience, that Antonino Rossi would really burn down his empire for a woman who could never give him heirs. It was the last time she would let herself believe. Giuliana Rossi sat in the sunroom of the Upper East Side mansion, a glass of Sancerre in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling through emails with the kind of boredom that came from having absolutely nothing meaningful to do with her life. She'd already done her morning Pilates class at Equinox, already had her facial at the spa on Madison Avenue, already spent 2 hours at Bergdorf's buying things she didn't need with money that wasn't really hers. This was her existence at 34, beautiful, wealthy, and utterly empty. The mansion itself was a monument to a marriage that had never been about love. 18 rooms filled with art and antiques, and the kind of carefully curated beauty that happened when you hired the best interior designers money could buy. Giuliana had chosen none of it herself. The Serra family, her family, had arranged this marriage when she was 26 and Antonino was 34, a political alliance that saved 2 rival crime families from destroying each other and created the most powerful criminal empire on the East Coast. She'd never loved Antonino. She suspected he'd never loved her either. But love wasn't the point. The point was power, stability, and the continuation of bloodlines that stretched back to Sicily. They had an arrangement that worked perfectly well. He ran his empire, she maintained the appearance of respectability, and they both understood their roles in this carefully choreographed performance of a marriage. Until 2 years ago, when Giuliana's private investigator confirmed what she'd already suspected, Antonino had a mistress, some woman he kept in Queens, of all places, a doctor at a public hospital, someone completely inappropriate, completely wrong for his world, completely impossible. Giuliana hadn't been angry. Mistresses were expected in their world, as long as he came home, as long as he maintained appearances, as long as he didn't humiliate her publicly. She couldn't care less where he spent his evenings. If anything, the mistress made her life easier. It meant she didn't have to pretend to want him in her bed, didn't have to perform affection she'd never felt. But then the email arrived. It came from a contact she paid very well to monitor certain databases, to flag certain names, to keep her informed of things she needed to know. Medical records weren't supposed to be accessible, of course. HIPAA laws and privacy regulations and all those lovely legal protections. But in New York, everything had a price, and Giuliana had learned long ago that information was the most valuable currency of all. The subject line was simple: urgent, Isabel Moretti, medical update. Giuliana set down her wine glass and opened the email, already knowing this would be interesting. She'd been monitoring Isabella Moretti for 18 months now, ever since the private investigator confirmed she was Antonino's regular companion. Knowledge was power, and Giuliana believed in being very, very powerful. The email contained a scanned laboratory report from Elmhurst Hospital. Official letterhead, patient name, Isabella Moretti, age 37, diagnosis ovarian carcinoma, stage 3, recommended treatment, total abdominal hysterectomy with bilateral salpingo-oophorectomy, prognosis, 75 to 80% 5-year survival rate with aggressive treatment, fertility preservation, not possible due to disease progression. Giuliana read the report 3 times, and with each reading she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not sympathy for the dying woman, not concern for her husband's emotional state, but pure crystalline triumph. Isabella Moretti was infertile. The mistress who'd occupied her husband's attention for 2 years, who'd apparently convinced him she was special somehow, who'd made him smile in ways Giuliana had never seen in 8 years of marriage, that woman could never give Antonino Rossi children, could never continue his bloodline, could never fulfill the one fundamental requirement that mattered in their world. Giuliana picked up her wine glass again and took a slow, deliberate sip. The Sancerre tasted better than it had 5 minutes ago. Everything tasted better when you were winning. She understood the mathematics of their world better than most. A capo without heirs was a capo with an expiration date. The families tolerated leadership only as long as it promised continuity, stability, dynasty. Antonino could control territories and command armies and inspire fear in men twice his size, but none of that mattered if he couldn't produce legitimate children to inherit what he'd built. Giuliana could give him that. She was 34, healthy, and came from proven bloodlines. The Serra family had been producing heirs for 5 generations without issue. She'd been examined by the family's private physicians before the marriage was arranged, her fertility confirmed and documented like livestock being appraised before purchase. It had been humiliating then. Now it was leverage. The mistress was 47 and dying and infertile. The wife was 34 and healthy and fertile. The choice, when reduced to its essential elements, wasn't a choice at all. Juliana stood up from the sunroom and walked through the mansion, her heels clicking on marble floors that cost more than most people's houses. She passed the formal dining room where they hosted the dinners that maintained their facade, the library filled with books neither of them read, the master bedroom they hadn't shared in 3 years. All of it was theater, performance, the elaborate staging required to maintain power in a world built on tradition and bloodlines. She found herself in the room that had been designated as a future nursery, though they'd never discussed it explicitly. It was currently empty except for some exercise equipment she never used. Juliana stood in the doorway and imagined it filled with the kind of Italian antique furniture that signaled wealth and continuity, a crib that cost more than a car, a rocking chair that had belonged to some Rossi ancestor, all the material evidence of dynasty and legacy and power passed from one generation to the next. That room would be hers now. Her children would sleep there. Her bloodline would continue the empire, not Isabel Moretti's, not the mistress who dared to think she could matter in a world where biology was destiny. Juliana pulled out her phone and composed a text to Antonino. Simple, direct, the way you delivered information when you held all the cards. I know about Isabella. I know about the cancer. And I know what it means for your future. We should talk tonight. She hit send and waited. The response came in less than a minute. How do you know that? Juliana smiled. He was rattled. Good. Men made mistakes when they were rattled. Revealed truths they meant to keep hidden. She typed her response carefully, each word chosen for maximum impact. I know everything, Antonino. I always have. The question is, what are you going to do about it? You need heirs. She can't give them to you. I can. Do the math. She didn't wait for his response. She set down her phone, picked up her wine glass, and walked back to the sunroom. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the Upper East Side in golden light. Somewhere in Queens, Isabella Moretti was probably crying in the arms of a man who would have to choose between love and legacy. Somewhere in Manhattan, Antonino was realizing that his perfectly controlled world had just shifted beneath his feet. And here, in this mansion that had never been a home, Juliana Rossi sat in her designer sunroom and understood with absolute certainty that she had already won, not through love or passion or any of those useless emotions, but through the cold, simple mathematics of power. Biology was destiny, dynasty was forever, and mistresses, no matter how beloved, were always disposable when they couldn't fulfill their biological function. Juliana raised her glass in a private toast, to fertility, to leverage, to the victory that came from simply being born with the right organs in working order. 2 weeks until Isabella's surgery. 2 weeks until Antonino would have to face reality. 2 weeks until the mistress learned what Juliana had always known. In their world, love was luxury, power was necessity, and women who couldn't produce heirs were nothing but beautiful, dying distractions. She'd already won. Now she just had to wait for Antonino to realize it. Antonino was in his private office in Midtown when Juliana's text arrived. The office existed in official records as a consulting firm, the kind of vague corporate entity that laundered money and legitimized empire. In reality, it was the nerve center of his operation, the place where he made decisions that affected thousands of lives across 3 states. He'd been reviewing territory reports from New Jersey when his phone buzzed with messages that changed everything. The first text made his blood run cold. Juliana knew, not just suspected, not just guessed, but knew with the kind of specific detail that meant she had access to information she shouldn't have. Medical records were supposed to be private, protected by laws that meant something. But in their world, laws were suggestions, and privacy was an illusion for people without enough money to buy truth. The second text was worse. You need heirs. She can't give them to you. I can. Do the math. Antonino stared at his phone for a full minute, feeling something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Fear. Not the kind that came from physical threats or rival families or FBI investigations. The kind that came from losing control of the narrative, from having someone else hold cards he didn't know were in play. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out at Manhattan's skyline. Somewhere in that city, Isabella was probably still awake, probably researching her own diagnosis with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that doctors brought to their own mortality. Somewhere else, Juliana was sitting in their mansion, waiting for him to respond, knowing she'd just played a winning hand. His phone rang, not Juliana, Massimo, his consigliere, his most trusted advisor, the man who'd served his father before him. Antonino answered on the second ring. We need to talk, Massimo said without preamble. Private, now. 20 minutes later, Antonino was in the basement level of a restaurant in Little Italy, sitting across a table from Massimo Carbone, 62 years old and wiser than anyone Antonino had ever met. Massimo had the kind of face that revealed nothing, the product of 40 years navigating the deadly politics of their world. He ordered espresso for both of them, and waited until the waiter was gone before speaking. "Juliana called me an hour ago," Massimo said quietly. "She wanted me to understand the situation clearly, to advise you properly. So let me be very clear, Antonino. You're standing at a crossroads, and the choice you make in the next week will determine whether the Rossi Empire survives or collapses." Antonino said nothing. He'd learned long ago to let Mifino finish before responding. The old man rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. "Isabella Moretti is dying," Massimo continued. "Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but stage 3 cancer is a death sentence that's just taking its time. Even if she survives, and 75% is not certainty, she'll never give you children, never continue your bloodline, never fulfill the one function that matters in our world." "I love her," Antonino said quietly, and saying it out loud to Massimo felt like admitting weakness in front of an enemy. "I know," Massimo replied, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. "I've watched you with her. I've seen the way you change when she's around. Your father, God rest his soul, he never looked at your mother the way you look at Isabella. It's real, I don't question that." "But," Antonino asked, because there was always a but. "But love is a luxury we can't afford," Massimo said simply. "You know this, Antonino. You've always known this. We don't marry for love. We marry for alliance, for power, for the continuation of what our fathers and grandfathers built. Juliana is Sarah family. Her father controls the ports. Her uncles control the unions. That alliance is the foundation of everything you have." "I could walk away," Antonino said. "Take Isabella somewhere they can't find us. Start over." Massimo took a slow sip of his espresso, and when he set down the cup, his eyes were harder than before. "No, you can't, because walking away means the Rossi territories become open ground. It means war between the families that we've kept peaceful for 8 years. It means your soldiers, the men who've sworn loyalty to you, they get caught in the crossfire. It means everything your father built, everything you've built, it crumbles into chaos and bloodshed." "There has to be another way," Antonino insisted. "There isn't," Massimo said flatly. "I've been in this world for 40 years. I've seen men try to choose love over duty. I've buried every single one of them. Either their enemies killed them, or their own families did, or the guilt of watching everything collapse destroyed them from inside. There is no middle path, Antonino. There's only the choice between the woman you love and the empire you're responsible for." Antonino felt something tighten in his chest. "What if I choose her anyway?" "Then hundreds of people die," Massimo said quietly. "Your soldiers, their families, innocent people caught in territory wars. The carefully balanced peace we've maintained for almost a decade. It shatters, and when the dust settles, when the bodies are counted, you'll hate yourself for choosing one woman over all those lives. You'll hate her for being the reason you failed everyone who depended on you." The silence stretched between them. Antonino could hear the muffled sounds of the restaurant above, normal people having normal meals, living normal lives that didn't require them to calculate human worth in terms of bloodlines and dynasty. "Juliana is fertile," Massimo continued. "She's young. She comes from proven bloodlines. She can give you 3, 4, 5 children if you need them. Legitimate heirs that the families will accept without question. You stay married to her. You do your duty. You continue the Rossi name. That's not betrayal, Antonino. That's survival." "And Isabella?" Antonino asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You let her go," Massimo said. "You make sure she has the best medical care money can buy. You set her up financially so she never has to worry about anything. You do right by her in every way except the one way that matters. And then you step back and let her live whatever life she has left without destroying everything else in the process." Antonino wanted to argue, wanted to say that Massimo was wrong, that there was a third option, that love should matter more than legacy, but he'd been raised in this world. He understood its mathematics. He knew what happened to leaders who put personal desire above collective survival. "I promised her I'd burn it all down for her," Antonino said. "Then you lied," Massimo replied. "Or you told a beautiful truth that you can't actually deliver on. Either way, the outcome is the same. You have to choose, Antonino. The woman you love, or the empire you're responsible for. You can't have both." Antonino closed his eyes. He thought about Isabella in her small apartment in Queens, trusting him to keep his promises. He thought about Juliana in their mansion, calculating and cold and absolutely right about the mathematics of power. He thought about the soldiers who depended on him, the families who relied on the stability he maintained, the delicate balance that kept their world from descending into chaos. He thought about love and duty and the space between them that couldn't be bridged. When he opened his eyes, Massimo was watching him with something that might have been sympathy, or maybe just the tired recognition of inevitability. "How long until her surgery?" Massimo asked. 2 weeks, Antonino said. "Then you have 2 weeks to figure out how to be the man she needs you to be. Even if you can't be the man she wants you to be," Massimo said. He stood up, placing a hand on Antonino's shoulder. "This is the loneliest part of leadership, my friend. Making choices that destroy the thing you love most to preserve everything else. Your father had to make the same choice once. It nearly killed him, but he made it, and the empire survived." Massimo left. Antonino sat alone in the basement of an Italian restaurant, staring at cold espresso, understanding with absolute clarity that he was going to break Isabella's heart, not because he wanted to, not because he didn't love her, but because in the cold mathematics of dynasty and power, love was always the variable that got sacrificed first. He pulled out his phone and looked at the last message from Juliana. Do the math. He'd done the math, and the answer was brutal. In 2 weeks, he would hold Isabella's hand before her surgery. He would promise her everything would be okay. He would let her believe he meant it. And then, when she was most vulnerable, most in need of him, he would choose the empire over her heart. Because that's what leaders did. They made impossible choices and lived with the consequences, even when those consequences felt like dying. The next 2 weeks were the cruelest gift Antonino had ever given anyone. He showed up at Isabella's apartment every evening after her shifts at Elmhurst, bringing food from restaurants she loved, sitting with her while she researched survival statistics and post-operative protocols with the obsessive focus of a doctor who couldn't stop being a doctor even when she was the patient. He held her when she cried, which wasn't often because Isabella had spent a lifetime learning not to show weakness. He made love to her with a tenderness that felt like goodbye, even though neither of them said the word out loud. During the day while Isabel worked her final shifts before medical leave, Antonino made arrangements. He called in favors, moved money, ensured that Dr. Richard Reeves at Mount Sinai would personally perform the surgery with the best surgical team in New York. He set up a private recovery suite that looked more like a luxury hotel than a hospital room. He organized round-the-clock private nursing care, the kind that cost more per day than most people made in a month. Everything money could buy, he bought. Everything power could command, he commanded. Everything except the future he'd promised her. On the 5th night, Isabella was sitting cross-legged on her couch, laptop open, reading through medical journals about stage 3 ovarian cancer outcomes. She was wearing one of his shirts and pajama pants, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked young and vulnerable, and completely unaware that she was living on borrowed time in more ways than one. "Listen to this," she said, looking up from her screen. "Patients who maintain positive psychological outlook during chemotherapy show measurably better outcomes. Apparently attitude affects immune response at a cellular level." She paused, her voice dropping. "But I'm a doctor, Antonino. I know what 75% survival rate really means. It means 1 in 4 women with my diagnosis die within 5 years. Those aren't odds I'm comfortable with." Antonino sat down beside her, pulling her against his chest. "You're not going to be a statistic. You're going to survive this. You're going to beat it. And when you're recovered, we're going to—" He stopped. The lie had been on the tip of his tongue. "We're going to leave together. Start over. Build the life we talked about." But the words wouldn't come, choked by the knowledge of what he'd already decided in that basement restaurant with Massimo. "We're going to what?" Isabella prompted, turning to look at him. "We're going to celebrate," he finished lamely. "Somewhere beautiful. Anywhere you want to go." She smiled, and it broke something in his chest. "I've always wanted to see the Amalfi Coast. Your family is from there, right? You could show me where your grandfather grew up. We could eat real Italian food and swim in the Mediterranean, and pretend we're normal people for a few weeks." "Yes," Antonino said, and hated himself for the lie. Exactly that. On the 8th night, Isabella's mother came to visit from New Jersey. Maria Moretti was 62, a retired nurse who'd raised Isabella alone after her father died when Isabella was 12. She was small and fierce and looked at Antonino with the kind of suspicion that mothers reserved for men who would eventually break their daughters' hearts. They had dinner together in Isabella's small apartment, awkward and tense, with Maria asking pointed questions about Antonino's intentions that he deflected with practiced charm. After dinner, while Isabella was in the bathroom, Maria cornered him in the kitchen. "My daughter thinks you're going to marry her," Maria said quietly, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "She thinks when she recovers from this surgery you're going to leave your wife and make everything legitimate. Tell me I'm wrong." Antonino met her eyes and saw a woman who already knew the answer. I care about Isabella very much. That's not what I asked, Maria said. I asked if you're going to marry her, if you're going to give her the future she deserves. Because if you're not, if you're just keeping her warm until she's no longer useful to you, then you should leave now. Let her heal without hoping for something that's never going to happen. It's complicated, Antonino said. It's not complicated at all, Maria replied. You're married, you have responsibilities. You come from a world where mistresses are acceptable as long as they stay in their place. My daughter forgot her place. She fell in love with you and started believing in fairy tales, and now she's dying, and you're going to let her believe those fairy tales right up until the moment you break her heart. I would never hurt Isabella, Antonino said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. You already are, Maria said. Every day you let her believe in a future that doesn't exist, you're hurting her. The kindest thing you could do is tell her the truth now. Let her go into that surgery with clear eyes instead of false hope. Isabella came back from the bathroom then, and the conversation ended, but Maria's words stayed with Antonino for the rest of the evening, echoing in his mind like an accusation he couldn't answer. On the 11th night, Isabella showed him the apartment listings she'd been looking at online. Places in Manhattan, in neighborhoods where his world and hers could pretend to coexist. 2 bedrooms, she explained, because they'd need space for a home office. She talked about adoption agencies, about international options, about how they could still build a family even if biology had betrayed them. She planned their impossible future with the kind of desperate hope that came from staring at mortality and needing something to believe in. Antonino listened and nodded and hated himself more with every word. On the 13th night, 2 days before the surgery, Isabella asked him the question he'd been dreading. Are you going to be there? She asked. They were lying in her bed, her head on his chest, his hand tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. When I wake up from surgery, will you be there? Antonino thought about the meeting Massimo had scheduled for that same day. Territory negotiations with the Serra family, discussions about succession and heirs, and the future of the alliance that kept their world stable. A meeting he couldn't miss without revealing weakness. A meeting that would happen at exactly the same time. Isabella would be waking up from the surgery that would save her life and destroy her fertility. He could reschedule. He could tell Giuliana's father that family emergency required his absence. He could choose Isabella one more time, give her that one moment of comfort when she needed it most. But that would only make the inevitable betrayal worse. Better to start the separation now. Better to let her see his absence as the truth it represented. I'll try, he said, and felt her body tense against his. You'll try, she repeated, and there was something different in her voice now. Something that sounded like understanding. Not yes, not I promise, just you'll try. There's a business situation, Antonino started to explain. It's time sensitive, and if I can move it, I will, but your business comes first. Isabella finished for him. She sat up, pulling away from him, wrapping her arms around her knees. It always has. I just let myself forget that for a while. Isabella. No, she said quietly. It's okay. I understand. I've always understood, actually. I just didn't want to believe it. She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw the beginning of the truth she'd been avoiding. The recognition that fairy tales didn't come true for mistresses who forgot their place. That promises whispered in the dark weren't the same as vows made in daylight. That love, no matter how real, couldn't compete with duty, when duty had dynasty behind it. Tell me the truth, Isabella said. Right now. Are you going to leave Giuliana for me? Antonino opened his mouth. The lie was right there, ready to be deployed one more time. But looking at her face, seeing the fear and hope and desperate need for honesty, he couldn't do it. Not anymore. I don't know, he said instead, which was its own kind of lie because he knew exactly what choice he'd already made. Isabella nodded slowly. Then you should go. Isabella. Please, she said, and her voice cracked on the word. Just go. I need to be alone tonight. Antonino wanted to argue, wanted to stay and hold her and promise her everything would be okay, but he'd forfeited the right to comfort her the moment he decided the empire mattered more than her heart. He got dressed in silence, watching her sit on the bed with her knees pulled to her chest, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. At the door, he turned back one more time. I do love you, he said. That was never a lie. I know, Isabella said, but love isn't enough, is it? It never was. Antonino left her apartment and walked to his car, where his driver was waiting. 2 days until her surgery. 2 days until she would wake up infertile and alone, realizing that every promise he'd made was built on sand. He pulled out his phone and confirmed the meeting with Giuliana's father. territory negotiations and succession planning. The future of the Rossi Empire. The future that didn't include Isabella Moretti. The morning of the surgery, Isabella woke up at 4 a.m. in her apartment in Queens. She wasn't supposed to eat or drink anything after midnight, so she just lay in bed watching the ceiling, counting down the hours until 6 a.m. when her mother would arrive to take her to Mount Sinai. Her phone sat on the nightstand, silent. No message from Antonino. No last-minute promise that he'd change the meeting, that he'd be there, that she mattered more than whatever business arrangement required his presence. She'd known for 2 days that he wouldn't come, known it in the way doctors know when a patient's prognosis is terminal, when all the hope and positive thinking in the world can't change the fundamental mathematics of the situation. Antonino Rossi was a man who kept his empire through careful calculation and ruthless prioritization. She'd just learned definitively where she ranked in that calculation. Maria arrived at 5:30, letting herself in with the spare key. Isabella had given her months ago. She found her daughter already dressed in comfortable clothes, a small overnight bag packed and waiting by the door. They didn't talk much during the drive into Manhattan. What was there to say? Maria had warned her. Everyone had warned her, actually. You don't fall in love with married men from that world and expect happy endings. You don't become a mistress and dream of becoming a wife. You don't plan futures with men whose futures were decided before they were born. But Isabella had done all of those things anyway, and now she was paying the price. Mount Sinai Hospital looked different than Elmhurst. Everything was gleaming and new, with art on the walls and fresh flowers in the lobby, and the kind of quiet efficiency that came from having enough money to make problems disappear. Isabella checked in at the surgical wing, signed more forms, changed into a hospital gown in a private pre-op room that was bigger than her bedroom in Queens. A nurse came in to start her IV, to verify her identity with a barcode scanner, to confirm for the third time that she understood the procedure and its consequences. "Is anyone here with you?" the nurse asked, looking at the empty chair beside Isabella's bed. "My mother," Isabella said. "She's in the waiting room." "No spouse? Partner?" The nurse was just being thorough, just following protocol, but each question felt like a small knife. "No," Isabella said simply, "just my mother." The nurse made a note on her chart and left. Isabella lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the IV fluid drip cold into her veins. In a few hours she'd be unconscious. In a few hours they'd remove the parts of her that could have made her a mother. In a few hours she'd wake up to a future that looked nothing like the one she'd imagined. Dr. Reeves came in at 7:30, dressed in surgical scrubs, his manner calm and professional. Isabella knew him by reputation. The best oncological surgeon on the East Coast, the one doctors sent their own families to when cancer came calling. Antonino had chosen well, at least in this. He'd given her the best medical care money could buy, even if he couldn't give her himself. "How are you feeling, Dr. Moretti?" Reeves asked, and Isabella appreciated that he used her title. A small acknowledgement that she was a colleague, not just a patient. "Terrified," she said honestly, "but ready." "That's normal," Reeves said. "I've reviewed your case extensively. The cancer is aggressive, but it's contained. We caught it early enough that I'm very optimistic about your long-term prognosis. The surgery will take approximately 4 hours. We'll remove your uterus, both ovaries, and fallopian tubes. We'll also do a thorough examination of your abdominal cavity to ensure we haven't missed any metastasis. You'll wake up in recovery, and if everything goes well, you'll move to your private room by this afternoon." Isabella nodded. She knew all of this already, had read the surgical protocol a dozen times, but hearing it from Reeves made it real in a way that research couldn't. "Do you have any questions?" Reeves asked. Isabella wanted to ask if it would hurt, if she'd feel different after, like something fundamental had been carved out of her. If women who couldn't have children were still complete women, or if they became something else, something less. But those weren't medical questions. Those were existential ones, and Reeves couldn't answer them any more than she could. "No questions," she said. Reeves left. The anesthesiologist came in, introduced himself, explained what would happen when they wheeled her into the operating room. More protocols, more confirmations, more signatures on forms that said she understood she might die, might have complications, might wake up to a body that no longer worked the way bodies were supposed to work. At 8:15, they came to take her to surgery. Maria was allowed in for one final moment. She held Isabella's hand, kissed her forehead, whispered a prayer in Spanish that their grandmother had taught them both. Then she stepped back, tears streaming down her face, and the orderlies began wheeling Isabella's bed down the hallway toward the operating rooms. Isabella closed her eyes as they moved through the corridors. She could hear the sounds of the hospital around her, beeping machines, muffled conversations, the squeak of wheels on linoleum. She thought about Antonino, somewhere across the city, sitting in a meeting with Juliana's father, discussing territories and alliances, and the future of an empire that had no room for dying mistresses who couldn't produce heirs. The hallway seemed endless, white walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant that would always remind her of this moment for the rest of her life. And then she heard footsteps, running, fast and urgent, echoing in the sterile corridor. "Wait," a voice said, his voice, "Wait, please." The orderlies stopped. Isabella opened her eyes and turned her head. Antonino Rossi stood in the middle of the hospital corridor, breathing hard like he'd run the entire way. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie straight, every inch the powerful capo who commanded respect and fear, but his eyes were wild, desperate, the eyes of a man who'd made a choice and immediately regretted it. "I need a moment," he said to the orderlies. "Please, just one moment." They looked at each other uncertainly. This was Mount Sinai. They had protocols, schedules, a surgical team waiting. But something in Antonino's voice, in his presence, made them step back, made them give him space. He came to Isabella's side, taking her hand in both of his. His hands were shaking. She'd never seen his hands shake before. "You came," Isabella whispered. "I almost didn't," he said, and his honesty was more painful than a lie would have been. "I was in the meeting. I was sitting there talking about territory percentages and succession planning, and I realized," his voice cracked, "I realized I was choosing an empire over the only person who ever made me feel human." Isabella felt tears sliding down her temples, pooling in her ears. "But you're here now." "I'm here now," he confirmed. "I walked out, left Juliana's father sitting at the conference table. I don't know what that means for tomorrow, for next week, for the future, but I couldn't let you go into surgery thinking you don't matter, thinking I chose them over you." "Didn't you?" Isabella asked softly. Antonino's face twisted with something that looked like pain. "Yes. For 2 days I did. I convinced myself that duty mattered more than love, that the empire was more important than you, and then this morning, sitting in that meeting, I understood something Massimo will never understand. An empire without you in it isn't worth having." Isabella wanted to believe him, wanted to let his words erase the last 2 days of abandonment and broken promises, but she was about to have her body permanently altered, about to lose the ability to give him the one thing his world demanded. "I can't give you children," she said, the words tasting like ash. "After this surgery, I'll never be able to give you heirs. My empire needs me to be more than just a capo." Antonino interrupted. "It needs me to remember that power without purpose is just violence. You make me better, Isabella. You make me want to be better. And if I lose that, if I lose you, then everything else is just empty houses and meaningless territories." He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "I don't know how we make this work. I don't know how I navigate Juliana and her father and all the politics I just walked away from. But I know I can't watch you go through this alone. I know I can't let you believe, even for a second, that you're disposable to me." "Sir," one of the orderlies said gently, "we really need to get her to surgery. Dr. Reeves is waiting." Antonino straightened, but he didn't let go of Isabella's hand. "I'm coming with you, as far as they'll let me." They started moving again, down the corridor, toward the surgical wing. Antonino walked beside her bed, holding her hand, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum beside the squeak of gurney wheels. They passed through double doors into the pre-surgical area. A nurse approached, apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but only hospital staff beyond this point." They'd reached the final barrier. Beyond those doors was the operating room, the surgical team, the machines that would keep her alive while they cut away parts of her body, the future that would happen, whether Antonino was there or not. He squeezed her hand one more time, and Isabella could see everything in his eyes, love and fear and desperation and the knowledge that this might be the last moment before everything changed forever. Isabella woke up to the sound of machines beeping in steady rhythm. Her mouth was dry, her throat raw from the breathing tube they'd removed while she was still unconscious. Everything felt distant and blurred, like she was underwater, sounds and sensations reaching her through layers of fog. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain radiated from her abdomen, sharp and insistent, reminding her exactly what had been done to her body while she slept. She opened her eyes slowly, searching. The recovery room was bright, too bright, with that particular quality of hospital lighting that made everything look sterile and unreal. Her vision was blurry from the anesthesia, but she could make out shapes, machines, a nurse, an empty chair beside her bed. Empty. "Antonino?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. A nurse appeared in her field of vision almost immediately, smiling with professional warmth. "Welcome back, Dr. Moretti. the nurse said, checking the monitors beside Isabel Bez. The surgery went very well. Dr. Reeves will be in to talk to you shortly, but everything went exactly as planned. You're going to be just fine. Where? Isabella tried to focus her eyes, tried to make sense of the empty space where he should have been. Where is he? The man who was with me before surgery? The nurse looked confused for a moment, then checked her clipboard. Your mother is in the waiting room. We'll bring her back once we've moved you to your private room. Should be about 30 minutes. No, Isabella said, fighting through the fog of medication. Not my mother. There was a man, dark suit. He said he'd be here. He promised he'd be here when I woke up. The nurse's expression shifted to something that looked like pity. I'm sorry, sweetheart. There's been no one here except medical staff. Just your mother in the waiting room. Is there someone you'd like us to call? Isabella stared at the ceiling, feeling something crack open inside her chest. He'd promised. He'd run down that corridor, held her hand, looked into her eyes and sworn he wouldn't let her go through this alone. He'd said he was choosing her, that he'd walked out of the meeting, that the empire without her wasn't worth having. And he wasn't here. Dr. Moretti? The nurse prompted gently. Should we call someone? No, Isabella whispered. There's no one to call. The nurse squeezed her hand sympathetically and moved away to check on another patient. Isabella lay there, feeling the pain medication drip into her veins, feeling her body trying to knit itself back together around the empty spaces inside her abdomen where her organs used to be, empty spaces beside her bed where Antonino should have been, empty spaces in her future where all the promises used to live. Maybe he'd been called away. Maybe there was an emergency. Maybe he was coming and just got delayed. Isabella clung to these possibilities like lifelines, even as part of her knew they were just more fairy tales, more beautiful lies she was telling herself to delay the inevitable moment of understanding. Dr. Reeves came in 20 minutes later, still in his surgical scrubs, looking satisfied with his work. He pulled up a chair beside her bed and explained everything in precise medical detail. Clean margins, no unexpected metastasis, all affected tissue removed, lymph nodes clear. The surgery had been, by every measurable standard, a complete success. You'll start chemotherapy in 4 weeks, Reeves said. 12 weeks of treatment, aggressive but manageable. Your prognosis is excellent, Dr. Moretti. Barring any complications, I see no reason why you shouldn't have a full recovery and a normal lifespan. Isabella barely heard him. Her eyes kept drifting to the door, expecting it to open, expecting Antonino to rush in with some explanation. Traffic, emergency, misunderstanding. Something that would make sense of his absence. Something that would prove her wrong for the terrible understanding that was growing in her chest like a second cancer. Dr. Moretti, Reeves said. Do you have any questions? Did anyone ask about me? Isabella heard herself say. During the surgery. Did anyone come looking for me? Reeves frowned slightly. I'm not sure. I was in the operating room for 4 hours, but the nursing staff would have noted any inquiries. Why do you ask? No reason, Isabella said. Thank you, Dr. Reeves. He left, still looking concerned. They moved her to a private room that looked more like a hotel suite than a hospital room. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, a couch that converted to a bed, a private bathroom with a shower, fresh flowers on the bedside table. Everything Antonino's money could buy except the one thing she needed most. His presence. Maria came in shortly after, her eyes red from crying, her rosary beads still clutched in one hand. She pulled a chair close to Isabella's bed and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently, and in her mother's eyes, Isabella saw the confirmation she'd been dreading. The knowledge, the understanding. He's not here, is he? Isabella said. Not a question. A statement. Maria's face crumpled with sympathy and anger. No, Misha, he's not here. Did he call? Send a message? Anything? Nothing, Maria said quietly. I've been in the waiting room for 6 hours. No one came. No one called. Isabella felt something fundamental break inside her. Not her body. That was already broken, already carved open and stitched back together. But something deeper. The part of her that had believed, that had trusted, that had let herself imagine a future where promises meant something, and love conquered duty, and fairy tales came true for women, foolish enough to fall in love with married men from worlds they didn't belong in. He came before the surgery, Isabella said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant, clinical, the voice she used when delivering terminal diagnoses. He ran down the corridor, told me he walked out of the meeting, said he was choosing me, that he couldn't let me go through this alone. I know, Maria said. I saw him. I saw the way he looked at you. Then where is he? Isabella's voice cracked on the question. If he meant it. If he really chose me, where is he? Maria didn't answer. There was no answer that would make it hurt less. They both knew where he was, back in his real life, back with Juliana, back in the world of territory negotiations and dynasty politics, and all the obligations that mattered more than the woman dying alone in a hospital room he'd paid for. He lied, Isabella said, and saying it out loud made it real. Or maybe he didn't lie exactly. Maybe he meant it in that moment. But the moment passed, and I was in surgery, and he had time to think about what he'd done, walking out of that meeting, choosing me over the empire, and he realized he'd made a mistake. Isabella. So he left, Isabella continued, the words spilling out now, unstoppable. He paid for the private room, made sure I had the best surgeon, covered all the medical expenses, did everything money could do, and then he walked away. Because that's what you do with mistresses, right? You take care of them financially, you're generous, you're kind, but you don't stay, you don't choose them, you don't keep promises that would cost you something real. Maria was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry, Mija. I'm so sorry. Isabella wanted to cry too, wanted to let herself fall apart the way her mother was falling apart. But she couldn't. The doctor in her, the part that had spent years learning to compartmentalize pain and focus on survival, wouldn't let her. She'd cry later, when her mother wasn't watching, when she was alone in this expensive room overlooking a city full of broken promises. How do you feel, Mija? Maria asked, wiping her eyes. Physically. Are you in pain? Yes, Isabella said. But they're managing it. They sat in silence for a while. Isabella stared out the window at Manhattan's skyline, watching the sun begin to set behind the buildings. Somewhere in that city, Antonino was living his life, making decisions, commanding respect, being exactly who he'd always been, a man who loved her but couldn't keep her, a man who promised forever but meant right now, a man who would burn down the world for her, in theory but couldn't miss a single meeting in practice. At 7 p.m., a delivery arrived, 24 white roses in a crystal vase. The card was simple, written in handwriting that wasn't his. Wishing you a full recovery. Ness A.R. Isabella stared at the card for a long moment. A.R., not even his full name, not a phone call, not a visit, not an explanation, just flowers. The kind you sent to business associates. Professional courtesy. Appropriate distance. Get them out, Isabella said quietly. What? Maria looked up from her rosary. The flowers. Get them out of my room. I don't want to see them. Maria quickly removed the vase, carrying it out to the hallway. She came back and sat down again, taking Isabella's hand. He's a coward, Maria said with sudden fierceness. He promised you everything and gave you nothing. He's a coward and you deserve better. Isabella squeezed her mother's hand. I know, I've always known. I just didn't want to believe it. At 9 p.m., Maria reluctantly went home to get some rest, promising to return first thing in the morning. Isabella assured her she'd be fine, that the nurses were taking good care of her, that she needed to sleep anyway. Maria left, and Isabella was alone in her luxury hospital room, overlooking a city that sparkled with a million lights. She pulled out her phone. No missed calls, no messages, nothing. She typed out a text to Antonino, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. What was there to say? He already knew what he'd done, knew he'd broken his promise, knew he'd left her alone in the moment she needed him most. Saying it out loud wouldn't change anything. Instead, she set down her phone and lay back on the hospital bed, feeling the pain medication making her thoughts fuzzy at the edges. She thought about the moment in the corridor, the way he'd looked at her, the desperation in his eyes, the promise in his voice. He'd meant it. She truly believed that. In that moment, he'd meant every word. But moments passed. Reality reasserted itself. And when the choice came down to her or everything else, when the romantic gesture faded and duty called him back, he'd chosen everything else. Not because he didn't love her, but because love wasn't enough. It had never been enough. Not in his world. Not when measured against dynasty and legacy and the weight of generations. Isabella closed her eyes and felt the tears finally come. She cried for the future she'd lost, for the children she'd never have, for the fairy tale that had died somewhere between the corridor and the recovery room, for the man who loved her desperately but couldn't choose her, for the woman she'd been who believed in promises whispered in the dark. She cried until exhaustion and medication pulled her under into fitful sleep, and even in her dreams she was alone in that expensive hospital room, surrounded by empty chairs and broken promises and the devastating understanding that she had never been enough to make him stay. Isabella's phone rang at 11 p.m., 3 hours after she'd cried herself into exhausted sleep. She woke disoriented, reaching for it automatically, expecting her mother calling to check on her. The number on the screen was unknown. She almost didn't answer. "Hello." Her voice was hoarse from crying and the lingering effects of anesthesia. "Isabella." Antonino's voice, strained, tight with controlled panic. "Isabella, listen to me. I need you to listen very carefully." She sat up too fast, pain shooting through her abdomen. "Where are you? Why weren't you here? You promised." "I'm at the 19th precinct," he said, and the words hit her like physical blows. "I'm under arrest. They're allowing me one phone call and I'm using it to call you because I need you to understand. I didn't leave you. I would never leave you. They set me up." Isabella's mind, still foggy from medication, struggled to process this. "Who set you up? What are you talking about?" "Juliana. Her father. I don't know exactly how they did it, but I know it was them." His voice was raw with fury and helplessness. "I waited through your entire surgery. 4 hours, Isabella. I sat in that waiting room for 4 hours, and then I got a call about an emergency at the docks. A shipment problem that needed immediate attention. Time sensitive, lives at stake if I didn't handle it personally." "So you left," Isabella said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "So I walked into a trap," Antonino corrected. "I got to the warehouse and there were federal agents everywhere. DEA. They had a warrant. They had evidence I've never seen before planted in containers with my name on them, and they arrested me before I even understood what was happening." Isabella pressed her free hand against her mouth, trying to process this. How long have you been there?" 6 hours, Antonino said. "They processed me, booked me, and I've been waiting for my one phone call. My lawyers are working on bail, but it's going to take time. The charges are serious, Isabella. Federal drug trafficking. They're talking about holding me without bail because I'm a flight risk." "Oh my God," Isabella whispered. "I need you to know." "I tried," Antonino said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I tried to be there when you woke up. I wanted to be the first thing you saw. I wanted to hold your hand and tell you everything would be okay. But they made sure I couldn't. They made sure you'd wake up alone, thinking I'd abandoned you." Isabella felt tears sliding down her face again, but these were different from the ones she'd cried earlier. "I thought you chose the Empire. I thought you went back to Juliana. I thought everything you said in the corridor was just another beautiful lie." "No," Antonino said fiercely. "No. I chose you, Isabella. I walked out of that meeting. I ran to that hospital. I held your hand and I meant every word I said. They couldn't let me keep choosing you, so they made sure I couldn't be there." "How long?" Isabella asked. "How long will they keep you?" There was a pause. When Antonino spoke again, his voice was quieter, more resigned. "My lawyers say weeks, maybe months. They're going to fight it, but the evidence is extensive. Someone put a lot of work into making this stick, and even if we can prove it was planted, even if we can prove I was set up, that takes time. Time I don't have. Time you don't have." Isabella understood what he wasn't saying. She was about to start 12 weeks of chemotherapy, 12 weeks of her body being poisoned to kill whatever cancer cells might remain, 12 weeks of nausea and weakness, and her hair falling out, and he wouldn't be there. "I'm so sorry," Antonino said. "I'm so sorry, Isabella. You're going through the hardest thing in your life and I can't be there. I can't hold your hand through the chemo. I can't take care of you. I can't do anything except sit in a cell and wait for lawyers to fight a case that was designed specifically to keep me away from you." "It's not your fault," Isabella said, though part of her was screaming that it was his fault, that this was his world, his choices, his enemies that had led to this moment. "I'll call you," Antonino promised, "as often as they let me, and as soon as I'm out, the second I'm free, I'm coming to you. I don't care what's happening. I don't care what deals I have to make or what price I have to pay. I will get out and I will be with you." "Okay," Isabella whispered, because what else was there to say? "I love you," Antonino said. "I need you to remember that, when you're going through chemo and I'm not there, when you're scared and alone and wondering if I meant any of it. I love you. That was never a lie." "I love you too," Isabella said. There was a voice in the background, telling him his time was up. "I have to go," Antonino said, "but I'll call you as soon as I can. Be strong, Isabella, for both of us." The line went dead. Isabella sat in her hospital bed, phone still pressed to her ear, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. He hadn't abandoned her. He'd been sabotaged. Juliana and her father had orchestrated this perfectly, separating them at the exact moment she needed him most, making sure she'd spend the hardest months of her life alone, making sure the distance between them would grow until maybe, just maybe, she'd give up on him entirely. But she wouldn't. She couldn't, because for the first time in 2 years, Antonino had actually chosen her. He'd walked out of that meeting. He'd waited through her surgery. He'd tried to be there. And even now, locked in a cell with federal charges hanging over his head, his first phone call had been to her. That had to mean something. The next 12 weeks were the longest of Isabel's life. She started chemotherapy 4 weeks after surgery, once her body had healed enough to withstand the assault. The treatment was aggressive, designed to kill any remaining cancer cells with the kind of chemical warfare that didn't discriminate between malignant and healthy tissue. Her hair started falling out during the second week. Not all at once, but in clumps that came away on her pillow, in the shower, tangled in her fingers. Maria helped her shave her head before it could fall out completely. Isabella stared at herself in the mirror afterward, bald and pale, and looking like a cancer patient instead of a doctor who happened to have cancer, and cried for an hour. Antonino called when he could. The prison allowed limited phone time, monitored and recorded, and he used every minute he was permitted. He never talked about his case, never mentioned the legal battles his lawyers were fighting. He just asked about her treatment, about how she was feeling, about whether she was eating enough and sleeping enough and taking care of herself. "I'm managing," Isabella would say, which was a lie. She was barely surviving. The nausea was constant. Food tasted like metal. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. But she didn't tell him that because what good would it do? He couldn't help her from a prison cell. He could only worry, and she refused to add to his burden. Maria was there for everything. Every chemo session, every moment of nausea. Every night Isabella woke up crying because her body felt like it was betraying her in 1,000 different ways. Her mother held her hair, what little remained when she vomited, brought her soup she couldn't eat, sat beside her bed reading aloud from books Isabella couldn't focus on. "He calls every week," Maria said once, during week 7, when Isabella was at her lowest point. "That boy. From prison. He calls and asks about you." "I know," Isabella said. "Do you think he'll keep his promise?" Maria asked. "To come to you when he gets out?" Isabella thought about this. Antonino was facing federal charges in a case designed to destroy him. Even if his lawyers could prove the evidence was planted, even if they could prove Juliana and her father had orchestrated the whole thing, that would take time, resources, political capital, and at the end of it all he'd still be married to Juliana, still tied to the empire, still choosing between love and duty. "I don't know," Isabella said honestly, "but I have to believe he'll try." By week 10, Isabella's body had adjusted to the chemical assault enough that she could function somewhat normally. She was still nauseous, still exhausted, still bald and pale, and 20 pounds lighter than she should be. But she could walk without feeling like she'd collapse, could eat small meals without immediately vomiting, could think about the future without it seeming like an impossible abstraction. Antonino's calls became less frequent, not because he'd stopped trying, but because the prison was restricting his phone privileges. His lawyers were making too much noise, filing too many motions, creating too much trouble. The system was punishing him for fighting back. But when he did call, his voice was the same, determined, fierce, full of promises he might not be able to keep. "How much longer?" Isabella asked during their last call, 2 weeks before her final treatment. "My lawyers say another month," Antonino replied. "Maybe less if they can expedite the hearing." "The evidence is falling apart, Isabella. They can prove the containers were tampered with. They can show the timeline doesn't work. We're going to beat this." "And then?" Isabella asked. "And then I come to you," Antonino said simply, "like I promised." Isabella finished her final chemotherapy session on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, 3 months after her surgery. Dr. Chen, her oncologist, scheduled her follow-up appointment with Dr. Reeves for 2 weeks later, a full body scan to check for any remaining cancer. The moment of truth that would determine if she'd survived or if the battle was just beginning again. She went home to her apartment in Queens, the same apartment where Antonino had promised to burn down his empire for her, and sat on her couch and realized she'd done it. She'd survived surgery, survived 12 weeks of chemotherapy, survived 3 months without him. She'd survived. Now she just had to wait to find out if her body agreed. 2 weeks later, Isabella stood in the corridor outside Dr. Reeves' office at Mount Sinai, waiting for her name to be called. She wore a soft cotton scarf wrapped around her head, covering the short, fuzzy growth that was slowly replacing the hair she'd lost. Her jeans hung loose on her hips despite Maria's best efforts to feed her back to health. She looked like what she was, a cancer patient waiting to find out if she'd actually survived. Her phone showed no new messages. Antonino's last call had been 3 days ago. Brief and strained, His hearing had been moved up. His lawyers were optimistic. He'd call her as soon as he knew anything. Isabella took a deep breath and checked in with the receptionist. Dr. Reeves was running a few minutes behind. She should take a seat. She turned toward the waiting area and froze. Antonino Rossi stood in the middle of the corridor, looking like he'd walked through hell to get there. His suit was wrinkled, not the perfectly pressed armor he usually wore. His face was thinner, shadowed with exhaustion and 3 months of fighting battles from inside a cell. But his eyes were the same, intense, focused entirely on her, like she was the only person in the world who mattered. "You came," Isabella whispered. "I promised I would," Antonino said, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. He stopped just in front of her, his hands hovering like he was afraid to touch her, afraid she might break. "Isabella." She looked up at him, this man who'd been arrested for choosing her, who'd spent 3 months in prison rather than make a deal that would require leaving her, who'd walked out of a courtroom this morning and come straight here without even stopping to change his clothes. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice cracking. Isabella almost laughed. She was bald under her scarf, 20 pounds underweight, pale and fragile, and nothing like the woman he'd made promises to 3 months ago. But the way he was looking at her, the way his hands trembled as he reached up to cup her face, she knew he meant it. He leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful, and full of 3 months of separation and fear and desperate hope. Isabella felt tears sliding down her face, but for the first time in 3 months, they weren't tears of despair. "Dr. Moretti?" A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Reeves is ready for you now." Isabella looked up at Antonino, suddenly terrified. "Come with me, please." Antonino took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Where else would I be?" They walked into Dr. Reeves' office together. The surgeon stood up, looking surprised to see Antonino but professional enough not to comment. He gestured for them to sit. "Your scans came back this morning," Dr. Reeves said, pulling up images on his computer screen. "I've reviewed them extensively with the oncology team." He paused, then smiled. "You're in complete remission, Dr. Moretti. No signs of cancer anywhere. You beat it." Isabella heard the words, but they didn't seem real. Complete remission, no signs of cancer. You beat it. She turned to look at Antonino and saw tears streaming down his face. This man who commanded empires and inspired fear and never showed weakness to anyone was crying in a doctor's office because she'd survived. "We made it," Isabella whispered. Dr. Reeves excused himself tactfully, leaving them alone in the office. Antonino pulled Isabella into his arms, careful of her still healing body, and held her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. "How did you get out?" Isabella asked against his chest. "You said the hearing was today." Antonino pulled back slightly, and she saw something complicated cross his face. "This morning, I made a deal with the federal prosecutors." "What kind of deal?" "The kind where I testify against other families," Antonino said quietly. "Not the Rossis, not my people, but others, rivals, enemies. I gave them information that will put away some very dangerous people." Isabella felt her stomach drop. "Antonino, that means—" "Witness protection," he confirmed. "We have to leave New York. Leave everything. They'll give us new identities. Relocate us somewhere far from here. Somewhere Juliana and her father and everyone else from my old world can't find us." "When?" Isabella asked. 2 weeks, Antonino said. "Maybe 3. Enough time." Isabella tried to— "We could adopt." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. No children. Not biological. Not adopted. Never. The future they'd imagined, the family they'd build together despite her infertility, was impossible. "So we have nothing," Isabella said, and hated how her voice broke. "We can't stay in New York. We can't have children. We can't have the life we planned. What's left?" Antonino cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "We have each other, Isabella. That's what's left. That's what I chose. I walked away from the Rossi Empire, from generations of power and legacy, from everything my father and grandfather built. I testified against people who will want me dead for the rest of my life. I gave up my name, my city, my entire identity, and I did it all for one reason." "Why?" Isabella whispered, though she already knew. "Because a life without you isn't worth living," Antonino said simply. "I don't need an empire. I don't need power or respect or any of it. I just need you. And if that means we start over in some small town in the middle of nowhere with nothing but each other, then that's enough. You're enough." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face. "We can't have children." "Then we won't have children," Antonino said. "But we'll have a dog, maybe 2. We'll have a house with a yard. We'll have quiet mornings and ordinary days and all the time in the world to love each other. We'll have everything that actually matters." "A dog," Isabella repeated, and found herself smiling through her tears. "A big one," Antonino promised. "The kind that takes up half the couch. The kind that makes you laugh when you come home from work. The kind that reminds us every day that family isn't just about blood. It's about who you choose to love." Isabella looked at this man who'd given up everything for her. His empire, his identity, his future, even the possibility of being a father, all of it sacrificed at the altar of loving her. And she understood something fundamental about what love actually meant. It wasn't about perfect endings. It wasn't about getting everything you dreamed of. It was about choosing someone so completely that nothing else mattered. Not empires, not dynasties, not even the futures you'd imagined. Just each other, and all the ordinary, beautiful days ahead. "Okay," Isabella said. "A dog, a new city, a new life. As long as we're together." "Always together," Antonino promised. "From now until forever." They left Mount Sinai hand in hand, walking out into the New York sunshine for one of the last times. In 2 weeks they'd be gone. New names, new city, new everything. But they'd have each other, and a dog, and remission, and love that had survived surgery and prison and sabotage and 3 months of separation. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.